like to introduce tonight's speaker, Lincoln Mitchell. Lincoln teaches in the Political Science Department and School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. So he's here from across the country tonight. He has a new book out, 3 Years Our Mayor, George Moscone and the Making of Modern San Francisco, which he'll talk about tonight, and just all the things, the amazing things that Mayor Moscone did when he was mayor, despite his short term as mayor. In addition to this book, Lincoln has written 8 other books about politics, history, and baseball in San Francisco. So, and in fact, we hosted Lincoln a few years ago when he presented on his book, Baseball Goes West. He's selling his book at the table in the back, too, so please take a look and support Lincoln and his work. Lincoln grew up in San Francisco and graduated from Stewart Hall and University High School before earning his BA from UC Santa Cruz and his PhD from Columbia. So now, without further ado, let's welcome Lincoln.
Thank you.
Can you read this?
I know I have one. Thank you. It's really great to be here at the Historical Society in person. I have an odd connection to the San Francisco Historical Society because I was born in New York. I grew up here, but the first San Franciscan I ever met was in the late 1960s in New York, and that was Charles Fracchia, who was one of the founders of the San Francisco Historical Society. So I go way back, and I see his son here tonight, and we'll be going to the ball game together later this week. Anyway, but thank you for coming tonight. I want to note, as I mentioned, that as Lana mentioned, that the books will be for sale. I'm selling them at a 25% discount. So takes a lot of work to write a book, takes a lot of work to put it together, and I can't cover everything in a talk today. So for more of that, I hope you will check out the book. I'm happy to sign or inscribe it. So I'm going to kind of start and end this talk with 2 different questions, because that would be boring otherwise, that will help frame this talk. And the first 2 questions as we begin are, why this book and why now? Why write a biography at this moment of someone who's been dead since late 1978? Why write a biography of someone like George Moscone at all? And a lot of trade publishers raised that question for me when I was writing this book, but fortunately, the University of Nevada Press was a little wiser. I think there's 2 reasons. The first is that George Moscone is, in fact, a hugely important and hugely overlooked figure in the politics and history, not only of this city, but of this state. And we'll get to some of that later, because to the extent people know about him, they tend to know the 3 years as mayor. And what they really know is his last 2 weeks, and what they really know is his last 2 hours. And George Moscone has entered the popular lore as the other guy who was assassinated along with Harvey Milk. And I think that's an unhelpful way to think of his memory, but also to understand our city and our state. The other reason is that San Francisco, I believe, is a oddly insufficiently studied and misunderstood city. And I believe that some of that is deliberate. So the New York Times was not around in 1855, but if it had been, it would have run a headline something like, San Francisco is over. Because they've been running that headline every 9 months that since I've been reading the New York Times, which is sometime in the mid-1970s. And if you go back and do the research, as I did, you can find that article over and over again. So some of this is on principle. They're going to misunderstand the city because they want to tell themselves that it's better to be somewhere else than San Francisco. But there's a little more to it than that. If you were taking an urban politics course, an urban studies course, anywhere outside of the state of California, or particularly Northern California, you would likely read more about New Haven, Connecticut than about San Francisco in serious study of politics, serious study of urban political power, serious study of how power works, how coalitions work, how different interests work. There's a 2-word answer for that, which is Yale University, but I will go to my grave, hopefully not for a long time, but I will go to my grave believing, and I hope that everyone here will as well, that San Francisco is a better and more important city than New Haven, Connecticut. So that's one of the reasons I wrote this book. I want to have a serious discussion about the politics and the political history of San Francisco. Too frequently, people's understanding of the city, whether they're getting off the plane for the first time as a tourist or were born and raised here or moved out here for their first job after college or something like that, goes something like Gold Rush, Earthquake, Summer of Love. Note the 60-year gap in which nothing happened. The assassinations, the tech boom. Note the 30-year gap in which nothing happened. I think there's more to history than that of this city. I was talking to a very well-respected historian who wrote a book about San Francisco from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. And he says one of the major points of feedback he got is, why didn't you write about Emperor Norton? This is like Emperor Norton Street we're on right now. But in terms of like real study of political science, I'm not sure how important Emperor Norton was. So I set out to write a biography because I think biography is a way to address this. I didn't want to write a boring political science book. I wanted to write something that brought the history, brought the politics, brought the life, brought this to life. And I'd never written a biography before, and I talked to people who had, but most of the people who I know who write biographies write them about baseball players. And George Moscone was a basketball player, so totally different. And when you write about someone a lot, you begin to feel this connection. And you begin to feel, I kind of felt after a while that George Moscone was my roommate, my kind of mythical roommate, although he's my father's generation. He's much older than I am, of course, if he were still alive. I put this up here. The very top here, this is the Oakdale, which is out by Stockton, where his mother was from. This is the birth announcement. You can't read it, but it's at the very top of the column there that Lena Moscone and her husband, George S. Moscone, have had a son in San Francisco named George R. Moscone. And the more I studied Moscone, the more it kind of felt oddly familiar in some respects. George Moscone grew up in the Cow Hollow district. Is anyone here from Cow Hollow? So that's a few of us, right? I grew up in the Cow Hollow district. George Moscone was raised by a single mother. I was raised by a single mother. George Moscone was Italian and Catholic. I was not, and am not. We both went to Catholic school. And those of you who know San Francisco well know how important both the Catholic impact on this city is and also the network of Catholic schools for so long. One way I tell my students this in New York is I say, in San Francisco, the most powerful Jewish politician ever to come out of this city went to Catholic school. And I said, and probably the only Jewish professor you're ever going to have from San Francisco also went to Catholic school. So I felt this kind of connection, which helped me get kind of more into it. This similar background. He grew up at the corner of Filbert and Buchanan, me at Greenwich and Lyon. As I talked to people, we'll get to that in a second. I want to spend a little bit of time of when he grew up, because we are all products of not just place, but of time. And George Moscone was deeply and unequivocally a product of this city, but he was also a product of his time. He was born in November of 1929. So let's think about that. Just after, we're in the Depression. He was a child of the Depression. He grew up this is the general strike, the longshoreman strike of 1934. This is a policeman beating up a striker. George Moscone grew up in a city of labor radicalism and of a very, very strong union city, right? Labor was very powerful here, and he grew up, this happened a few blocks from his house, right? You could walk from where this happened down in the Embarcadero by the piers to Filbert and Buchanan, if you're a young guy, not at 5 years old, but, you could walk there pretty easily. He was 5 years old. I don't know if he remembered this, but that was happening. That was in the air. And so I want to speak a little bit about his childhood here, because the book is called 3 Years Our Mayor, but it's really a biography of George Moscone. And it's really that tells the story of San Francisco in the middle half of the 20th century through the life of George Moscone. And so Moscone's youth, which he spent living in Cow Hollow, going to St. Bridget's School, which is where St. Bridget's Church is. I want to talk about the four pillars that I think defined Moscone as a young person and really stayed with him throughout his life. And some of these are more complicated than others. The first one is his mother. George Moscone was the only child of a single mother. He never spoke much about his father. Even his kids didn't speak much about their grandfather on that side. And when they did, they always more about curiosity. They didn't know as much. Even he would allude to him, but it was clear it was not a relationship where they spent a lot of time together. So his mother and he were very close. And we hear this throughout the kind of oral histories that I read to do my research for the book, people talking about his mother. His mother, by most accounts, very dedicated to him, but also very young. She was about 21 years old when he was born. So his oldest and closest friend, Cappy Lavin, tells about going over to the Moscone household, and he describes his relationship with Moscone's mother as much more jocular than with the other mothers, because she was much younger. So it was more kind of familiar and more like almost like an older sister of George Moscone, as the friend saw it. And then he says, and she always served beans. Now, this is an interesting footnote, but it also tells you something else, which is that they didn't have a lot of money, right? Because you don't eat beans, especially when guests are coming over, if you can afford kind of anything else, right? This tells you something. So that's one, his mother. The other was the church. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not suggesting that George Moscone was a devout Catholic who, like Jerry Brown, went to the Jesuits or something like that. But it was very important in his life. He grew up in a city. There's about one parish for every. I always say when you want to know the details of the structures of the Catholic Church, you should always ask a Jew. But there's about one parish for every 2,500 people. So it was kind of everywhere. It was still a city where you kind of talked about what parish you came from. We're going to get to this church. We're going to go back to the church, so to speak, in a second. But I want to go to the next one because basketball. And basketball was an extremely important part of Moscone's life throughout his life. He was, when Moscone first begins to appear in the local papers here in San Francisco, it's nothing to do with politics. It's because he's leading his high school, and we'll get to that in a second, to the city championship. He's an all-city basketball player. And when I spoke to people or read stories, read interviews that had been done with people who he knew in high school or with whom he had grown up, they're constantly talking about how and his kids would say that he would tell them stories about this, how they would go, George Moscone as a young man, as a boy, to the different neighborhoods to play basketball. And that's how we got a real feel for the city. Going to all these places, getting the neighborhoods, and if you grew up in San Francisco and you spent, I don't know if too much time, but maybe not enough time, but a lot of time wandering around the streets, you know what I'm talking about. You know that when you get out in the sunset, you better bring a jacket, and you know that if you're going to the Mission, you're going to learn a few words of Spanish that maybe you shouldn't say in your Spanish classroom on Monday, and you know where the stairs are, and you know what bus to take. You get a real feel for the city. And you also get exposed to the diversity of the city. Now, he grew up in a city that's about 95% non-Hispanic white. So it was different demographics, but it was lots of different ethnic groups, of whom Italians were close to the biggest. Now, this is a photograph of him playing basketball in junior college at Santa Rosa Junior College, just so you can see that, courtesy of their athletic department. The second... and the last major pillar was the city itself. So that's related to the basketball. He, from a very early age, moved around the city, loved the city, and it really defined who he was. He would spend his summers in Oakdale with his maternal grandfather, with his mother's parents, and he never talked about it because it wasn't important to him and his world once he got back. His world was San Francisco. Now, how many people here graduated from high school within the city limits of San Francisco? So enough of us, right? And you know this game we play, right? Where we say, where'd you go to school? And since this is we're in polite company, I won't quote John Burton on exactly how that plays out. But we know that we say, where'd you go to school? And then we judge each other, right? Oh, you went to Sacred Heart, you know. You went to Urban, must have hippie parents or something. You went to university, what are you, some kind of rich kid, right? You went to Lowell, oh, you're smart and maybe Jewish or Chinese or something, right? So we judge each other. And you're all laughing because you know exactly what I'm talking about. George Moscone went to St. Ignatius, okay? And it was defined much about him for the rest of his life, his identity with St. Ignatius. He led that team his senior year to the city championship, which, you know, is very impressive accomplishment. He immediately won the 9th grade elocution contest. I don't know what an elocution contest is, but apparently it was a big deal. So he excelled in both the academic side and the athletic side from a young age. So he was kind of a big man on a big campus. And those of you who went to Catholic school, particularly if you were men now and boys then, you know how important sports are in Catholic school. And it continued, those connections and relationships continued to be important throughout his life. I will give you one example to think about. In 1975, when George Moscone was running for mayor and legislating as the Senate Majority Leader, the Democratic leader of the state Senate, the governor of the state, Senate Majority Leader, and state Assembly Speaker had all gone to St. Ignatius. And this Assembly Speaker and Senate Majority Leader had been on the same team. Leo McCarthy was not a starter. George Moscone was a star. But that's not important. But that gives you a sense, and it also exposed him to a larger world, you know, and those networks helped him, you know, really throughout his life. And I want to just take a moment now and go back to this discussion about San Francisco, because after St. Ignatius, briefly the Navy, Santa Rosa Junior College, and then College of the Pacific, which is now University of the Pacific in Stockton. And then came back and went to what was then Hastings Law School, is now UC College of Law, down right not far from where we are now. But gradually, by the time he's, you know, growing into a man, finishing law school, late 50s, early 60s, the city is changing. And if we look at the last 20 years of George Moscone's life, from 1958 to 1978, the city changed dramatically. And the challenge facing Moscone, and that he excelled at, his perhaps singular political skill, in addition to, by the time he graduates from college, he's a good-looking, charming, athletic guy. That helps a lot. He's Catholic, he's Italian, he went to the right schools. From a political perspective, we're going to get back to that, all helps a lot. But this city is changing. There is a kind of, it's becoming a hub of the counterculture, gradually becoming a hub of what becomes a transnational LGBT civil rights movement. Right? All kinds of other civil rights movements here. The anti-war movement, a real radicalism. And at the same time, if you grew up here, if you were here then, you knew that if you went out, if you took the 38 Geary past about, you know, Arguello, suddenly you were in a very conservative city, where it mattered where you went to school, it was important if you were a basketball player, all of that. And to be able to go to work in both cities was essential. And especially if you were politically on the left, as he was. So I want to talk a little bit about his, more than a little bit, about his political career. And I want to begin by talking about George Moscone's first campaign for office. Now this, we're going to get to this now, but I think this is just a great photograph. You might say to yourself, who's that guy shaking George Moscone's hand? So after law school, and I also want to be clear, this is a biography. This is a serious work of scholarship. And I am not, while I admire him, this is not a man without flaws. And many of those are discussed in the book. And some of them, there's a kind of a prurient interest that some people have. I don't go into great depth, but I think we can safely say that very likely George Moscone today would be Me Too'd out of politics very quickly. And there's a fascinating discussion that I had with his younger son, which I quoted a bit in the book, about John Moscone not wanting to go to St. Ignatius and wanting to go to University High School, and his father forbidding it. And on balance, I don't know. We all regret going to the wrong high school. Maybe I don't know, but who knows? But it really tells you something about the man. So after law school, remember we talked about basketball. George Moscone is practicing law. He's a good lawyer, but he's not making a lot of money because he's taking on all these kind of hard luck cases, because that's the kind of person he was. And he has a job as a playground attendant. Does anyone know what a playground attendant was in San Francisco? Do you remember those people? They help out at the playground, right? And if you're George Moscone, probably shooting baskets and stuff, or teaching other kids how to shoot baskets. A few playgrounds over is his friend from who he met in high school and stayed friends with through law school. I should go back to law school for a second. While he's at Hastings, which was then Hastings, he doesn't have any money, as usual, because he gets a job as a custodian, so sweeping the floors. There's another guy who gets a job as a custodian sweeping the floors. Moscone, of course, is Italian. The other guy is African American. And they become friends. And that was Willie Brown. So these two guys met sweeping the floors in law school, which is, I think, kind of extraordinary. And Willie Brown was also friends with John Burton, who Moscone had known as Moscone was a few years older, but knew him when they were both in high school. Burton went to Lincoln, for those of you keeping score at home. And he, in his very eloquent way, said that Moscone saw him as he was in 9th grade. Moscone was in 12th. Moscone was the star of the all-city team. Burton was kind of, in his own words, not taking academics all that seriously. And Moscone reached out to him, and they became friends. And now Moscone and Burton are playground attendants in the Sunset. And he says to Burton says, so we were discussing all these things, broads, this and that. Now the antiquated sexist language notwithstanding, if you're married with 3 kids, shooting baskets and discussing broads on a Sunday, I don't know, this maybe not the best way to spend your time. But I say that because both it's the time, but also there were people that didn't spend their time that way then. And he says to John Burton, how does a guy get to be a judge? And Burton had never heard Moscone talk about politics before. Willie Brown had. And Willie Brown told me that immediately he said, I never met a white guy who was so, who took civil rights so seriously and cared so much about issues about African American people. John Burton says, I don't know, go talk to my brother. Serendipitously, his brother was Phil Burton, one of the greatest political minds of that generation. And Phil Burton, so John Burton, they all go to a diner, they sit down, they talk, and Phil Burton asked Moscone all these questions. What's your view on the death penalty? I'm against it. Should professors have to sign loyalty oaths? No. And he's giving all these very liberal answers, and Phil Burton is liking it. And then he says also, he's good-looking, he's Italian, he went to St. Ignatius, this guy can go places. And he says, here's what I want you to do. Run for the assembly. 1960, this is an assembly race. You'll lose, you'll get on the county committee, and the next opportunity comes, you'll take it. So he says, okay, he runs for the assembly, and he wins the primary easily, and then runs against Milton Marks. There's a name that will come up again. Marks drubs him. He was an incumbent, beats him badly, and Moscone goes back to the county committee. 3 years later, there's a spot in the Board of Supervisors. He runs, by that time we had at-large citywide elections. The 2 newcomers to the board, 2 former St. Ignatius teammates whose political futures will be intertwined for a while, George Moscone and Leo McCarthy, are both elected to the board. Now, Moscone was then in elected office he won that election in 63, so from January of 64 until his death in November of 1978, he's never out of elected office. The place where he made the least impression was the Board of Supervisors. He wasn't there as long, and but the one issue that was really important while he was on the board was freeways. And this is a map. This is from the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce. It's from the San Francisco Public Library, but the map was created by the Chamber of Commerce years ago. They gave us permission to use it. And these are all proposed freeways. So, like 19th Avenue, that's an actual freeway. This is the proposal. I can't reach up there, but you can see coming from the Panhandle to downtown, a real freeway. Right? Think of what that would do to the Western Addition, the Haight neighborhoods like that. Park Presidio, which is a real freeway, right? And this mobilizes neighborhood opposition. This is around the time that Robert Moses is destroying the Bronx, any of you from New York, with the Cross Bronx Expressway. And the people of San Francisco don't want these freeways. Now, the only people backing these freeways are the mayor, the governor, the Chamber of Commerce, much of the state legislature, and it's not so many people, and it's contested on the Board of Supervisors. And Moscone takes a and the neighborhoods are organizing against this. And this begins to define the battle between the downtown and the neighborhoods, which is both a geographical but also kind of political identities, which continue to define San Francisco politics for the rest of the century. And this is kind of the neighborhood movement in San Francisco. And it's important for a couple of reasons. One, they mostly win. They mostly stop these freeways. This is relevant to politics today in San Francisco. Outside players who have different ideas of the economic vision of San Francisco wanting to determine the city's future. Stop me if this sounds familiar. But also, it was real neighborhood organizing. And when I went to the library to do the research, the amazing thing was that there were letters from every neighborhood. Now, some of the neighborhoods have different names. The Haight-Ashbury wasn't known as Haight-Ashbury then, for example. But so many neighborhoods around the city, and by reading the letters, you could see that some were written by people with formal education, some were not, because they had grammatical mistakes. But it was across the economic spectrum of neighborhoods and the ethnic spectrum. So if you think about it, this freeway here in the Sunset, it's a lot of white working class areas. The Panhandle Freeway, as it came to be called, that's African American neighborhoods, right? So it's all kinds of different. Over here, these are Latino neighborhoods and also some African Americans. And the ones that got built were definitely the ones built mostly in the poorer communities. But Moscone makes his name by opposing these freeways. And then a spot on the state Senate comes up, and he decides to run for the Senate. And I want to, by the time he's running, I just want to see if I can get this, if this is the right, yeah. We're going to play it. Did they hit it again?
Let me say I'm delighted that I have them. I think my colleague would be equally delighted. I just happen to have gotten them first. They have never, in the 2.5 years that I've been on the board, asked me to do anything on behalf of themselves or anybody that they thought was a constituent of them. I have, on the other hand, asked the congressman in some instances to try to help people who have been involved in immigration problems because I thought that they were being treated badly. So I've taken some advantage of the congressman sometimes.
Okay, so that was George Moscone. And who's the them? It's the Burtons. So Phil Burton and John Burton, who were his strongest supporters, already there's this sense that they're doing something nefarious. And they were genuinely trying to take over the Democratic Party in the city and move it leftward. Whether you find that nefarious or not is a judgment call. And he's campaigning against Leo McCarthy, who represents a more conservative faction within the Democratic Party in a Democratic primary for the state Senate. But the reason I raise this is because it's a complicated political identity. Because on the one hand, as you can see in that video, he's a good-looking young guy, right? And he's talking about, and you can see the dynamism there. And people who knew him, when I was doing these interviews, people well into their 80s would tell me how handsome he was. So he's got that dynamism. He has genuine community credentials, and he's also closely associated with what critics called a machine. I used to refer to the book primarily as an operation because I don't think it's quite a machine in like the Daily Machine or traditional kind of urban politics sense. But I want to talk about the state Senate because, San Francisco, open seat, George Moscone wins the primary, wins the general election handily, but believe it or not, November of 1966 is a midterm election. There's no presidential election that year. The most important race in California was not for state Senate from San Francisco. It was for governor. And this guy gets elected governor. And Reagan and Moscone get to Sacramento at the same time, elected office. And by the way, Reagan during World War II was stationed at Fort Mason, very close to where Moscone lived during World War II. in Cow Hollow. So they may be like he asked Moscone for directions on Van Ness Street or something. I don't know. We'll never know, but it's possible, right? And by the end of 1967, Moscone is the state Senate Majority Leader. And he's trying to push through progressive legislation. And Reagan is governing very much from the right, much further from the right than any previous kind of Republican governor, although it was after 8 years of Pat Brown, who was Democrat. And they're clashing, and Moscone is struggling to get anything done. Now, he fights him on things like school lunches, trying to get a little more funding for school lunches. Moscone takes a strong position against the death penalty, doesn't get him anywhere. Then in 1974, there's a race for governor. He gets term limited out. Reagan gets term limited out, spent the next 6 years wanting to take the show, wanting to see if he could do more damage on a larger scale, so he starts running for president. And Moscone in late 73, mid-73, begins to run for governor. This is one part of his life that people don't know much about. He runs campaigns for governor. And there's a lot about this in the book. And he's in the mix a little bit, and then Pat Brown's son gets in the race. And on name recognition alone, Jerry Brown basically leaps to the head of the Democratic primary field, wins relatively easily, and of course becomes governor. And there's a bitterness. Moscone wrote a letter to his donors that was really bitter and really kind of almost out of character for him when he decided to get out of the governor's race just at the very end of 73. Just the very end of 73. Because the race... But Brown wins, and then in 1975, I'm not going to get into, because I want to be a little mindful of time, but he does a couple things in the state Senate that are very important. And I want to point at three in particular in 1 year. So this is a year when he's running for mayor. I'm going to talk a little about that race in a moment. When he's running for mayor and serving as Senate Majority Leader. And there's three issues. And the reason I want to keep this photo of Reagan up here for a second, besides this is a movie star, good looking now, is that Reagan is crafting, during his 8 years as governor, what becomes the foundation of the right wing in California from the mid-'60s until really the rise of Trump, when the Republican Party goes off in another direction. Moscone is helping to do the same for the Democratic Party. What by the 80s, 90s, early 21st century we identify as the progressive movement within the Democratic Party, Moscone's pushing for all those things. And I want to point to three pieces of legislation, and each of these I discuss in some depth in the book because there's some great anecdotes about these things, but they're really telling. Three pieces of legislation while he's running for mayor that he passes into law with the help from William McCarthy and Willie Brown on the Assembly side, and the governor signing into law, and also, importantly, the Lieutenant Governor, Mervyn Dimley, who casts a few important tie-breaking votes in the state Senate. And if you listen to these things, you'll say to yourself, you'll have your own opinions, whether you support these positions. I think he did the right thing on all three, but you'll say, you'll understand how that kind of begins to tell a progressive narrative, and you'll also say, if you're running in San Francisco, those are smart things. The first thing he does is to push through and make and turn into law a law decriminalizing consensual sexual relations between two adults of the same gender, right? So this is a landmark piece of LGBT legislation. It's a very big deal then. And the debate around this in the Senate, at one point, a Republican senator just goes into some, like prurient interest about what happens if two men at the beach and they're under a towel, and he's going on and on and on. And finally it gets done, and finally Moscone says, well, thank you for your enlightened comments. And then he goes on to the next person. So he's having some fun with it, but it comes down to the wire, and he passes it. And that's one important piece of legislation. The second one is decriminalizing possession of small and medium amounts of marijuana. And again, this is a close vote, but it's a landmark. California is one of the first states to do that. It's also one of the first states on the consensual sexual relations issue. And the third one, and this is where you could think this is important in San Francisco, because now Moscone by now has a very solid civil rights record. 1964, he went down to Mississippi to register voters. right? Not too many white lawyers from San Francisco doing that. And he wrote about it and talked about it. And of course, Willie Brown, every time he runs for office, is behind him 100%, and he's trying to bring resources into the community. He helped stop the freeway through the Panhandle. And he's marched with Cesar Chavez and the farm workers. So he's known as a leader on civil rights and a liberal on civil rights, to use kind of the language of the era. But at that time, in the state of California, the only people allowed to do acupuncture, think about this for a moment, are people who went to Western medical schools. So in other words, if you were, Chinese, and had trained in traditional Chinese medicine, which, like we're talking acupuncture here, right? There's a connection. It was illegal to perform acupuncture. The technical word for that is racism, and it goes back, these laws were passed in the late 19th century. And Moscone and Jerry Brown and the Assembly, they overturned that. And they made it legal for people who were trained in traditional Chinese medicine, who actually probably knew a lot more about acupuncture, than a Western medical school that might have like one elective on acupuncture, that they could do acupuncture too. And that begins to speak to crafting this multiracial view, right? And really what we would now call DEI, but we then called civil rights, and some people would just call, the equality and basic human rights. And those are the pillars as he's beginning to run for mayor. And I want to spend a minute on his, this late 1974, he announces he's running for mayor. And this is an extremely interesting and important election, which we'll talk about. But I want to begin with, this is kind of a lengthy clip, but I think you'll like it.
Well, by Christmas a year from now, San Francisco will have elected a new mayor. No way of telling who that person's going to be. But one man who's actually been on the campaign trail for the last 3 months officially announced his candidacy today.
Giving people confidence that City Hall really wants to help them, and that means going back into the neighborhoods and making the neighborhoods feel that they play a very distinct part in the future of San Francisco.
How do you do that?
You do that by the people that you appoint to your agencies, boards, and commissions, people who want to roll up their sleeves and not just flash badges around as sinecures. And there's plenty of people in this city who want to do a good job for their neighborhoods.
That says something about the kind of campaigning you're going to do.
It'll be a street campaign. There'll be no TV packaging or the typical type of gaudy campaign performance. Door to door, precinct to precinct, and one-on-one. And a good game because it will place more emphasis upon the willingness of candidates to say exactly what this city needs and not worry about whether or not their political and financial supporters will find that satisfactory.
Well, $1, good luck.
Thank you very much.
Hold on, hang on.
Spear. Now in the one is blonde.
Yeah, I know. It's nice to see you.
What have a duck for me?
Yes.
Good.
Yes, I've been there for about 5-6 years.
Good. I'm gonna run for mayor next year. I hope you can give us a hand.
Mayor.
I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I think we need a new one.
You think we do? Thank you.
Feliz Navidad.
Santi.
How are you?
Well, who's your Moscone? What's your name?
Politics is a collection of question marks, but one thing is sure. George Moscone and anyone else who wants to run for the mayor's job has a tough year ahead. The race starts now. Bill Hillman, Channel 5 Eyewitness News.
So first, extra credit for anyone who knows who the aide in the gray suit and the red tie was. All right, we'll get to that. But I love that clip for a lot of reasons. One, if you like videos of old San Francisco, you have to love that one. But you see him he says very much his agenda, which is the neighborhoods. Right? By 74, 75, if you could sum up his campaign in one word, that word is neighborhoods. He wants to take power away from downtown, which is, again, both a construct and a geographical place, and bring it to the neighborhoods. And he talks about appointing people to boards and commissions. That was groundbreaking stuff back then, that you wouldn't just have every board and commission full of straight white guys. And then that he seems to just be so comfortable on the streets, speaking Italian, speaking Spanish, talking to people. But the race, so this is the incumbent who's term limited out, Joe Alioto. And the woman on her, I don't know who that is, no. That's Dianne Feinstein, who was one of the candidates in the race. And this, I spent a lot of time in the book about this race because I love studying and writing about campaigns. I think we can learn a lot about a city. But basically, this is a race between George Moscone and Dianne Feinstein is thought by mid-'74 as the likely next mayor. At that time, she's still president of the Board of Supervisors. She had run in '71 and lost, but not hurt herself by running. She's broadly appealing. And she doesn't run a great campaign. And then what happens is that a guy named John Barbagellotta, who some of you may remember, runs and captures the kind of angry backlash of the moment. And Barbagellotta was a fascinating guy because he's the kind of politician who would always say, I'm not a politician, and then do things to prove that he wasn't a politician. But he was also very smart in that he understood that the only way he could win was if Feinstein got in the runoff against him, this was the first time we had runoffs in San Francisco, he would lose. And he couldn't take votes from Moscone. So he spent like 5 months just beating up on Dianne Feinstein, who was probably, someone asked me as we were chatting beforehand, would Feinstein have won if that had been a ranked choice vote race? And she very well might have. But in this, where there was no ranked choice voting, Barbagellotta just drubbed her. And the way to think about Barbagellotta is kind of a Frank Rizzo or a Rudy Giuliani without the charm. But I also don't want to be unfair because in a city, I guess that was kind of fair, but in a city, because the politics were very right-wing, angry urban backlash. But, compared to Moscone, who by this time had a pretty strong reputation as, a philanderer, as one politician I spoke to said, "Can we go off the record?" I said, "Yes." And the politician said, "He was a philanderer." And I said, "Yeah, I know that." But it wasn't great. And Barbagellotta had 8 kids. It was kind of, there's a campaign piece when he runs for supervisor, and for all the world, it looks like you were filming Sound of Music in San Francisco. But he had 8 kids, and there's no whispers of him being anything other than a good father and husband. So I think we should say that because we wouldn't say that about Rudy Giuliani. But it's a very intensely fought race. There frequently where we just had a race here for mayor. Well, look, I'm not being critical of Daniel Lurie. I think he bought the election fair and square. But from an ideological perspective, the difference between Lurie and Breed is not much, right? It's just style different, but the media wants to tell a story, but they're basically the same. Most of our mayors since Art Agnos ideologically have all been the same. This was a race that really the city was going to go potentially in a different direction. Moscone won by 4,400 votes, and I know that people have questions about that election. I will just say this. In my other life, I have worked on election fairness issues all around the world, and I know a lot about how elections are stolen, and that election was not stolen by the People's Temple. The People's Temple definitely supported Moscone, and it became this kind of right-wing received wisdom, but it didn't happen quite that way. But I want to just look at this. I love election maps. So I had a student who was much smarter than I am on this stuff, put this map together based on precinct by precinct returns from 1975. Now, this is a funny map because what he did was he took the old map and then recreated on the new map so he could use Google Maps, which was easier for him. So you'll see things like Oracle Park is on the map. Oracle Park obviously didn't exist then. You don't see Candlestick Park because it doesn't exist anymore, and the edges are a little sharper sometimes. But and so think of this as a typical election map. Dark blue, stronger Democrat. Barbagellotta was a Republican. Darker red up here, and then here, stronger Republican. And what's interesting to me about this map is you can very clearly see where Moscone won, right? Bayview, Hunters Point, Fillmore, Western Addition, and the Castro. Now, in 1975, before 1975, nobody had ever campaigned for a major office in the United States talking to African-American voters and what would then be used the term LGBT, gay and lesbian voters, and saying, I am going to fight for your civil rights and I have a record of doing it. No one had ever spoke to those two groups in those ways on a major race. This is the first time. Without the gay vote And it's hard because there's no exit poll data. So you have to extrapolate based on election districts, and there's always the problem of an ecological fallacy, but you're doing your best here. The data here is pretty clear, and I get into more of it in the book, and I look at the strongest precincts. And this is significant. In this race, the black and gay vote beat the angry vote and the rich vote. Full stop. That's what happened. Now, what's also interesting about this is that if you map onto any recent race in San Francisco, the most recent mayor's race is difficult. It's a five-way race, but it's hard to kind of get from here to there. But the recall of Chesa Boudin, the map looks pretty much the same. Dark blue against the recall, dark red for it. The recall of Gavin Newsom, again, not much of a race but in the city. But even with Trump, right, you'd have to adjust the numbers because there were so few districts where he did well. This basic pattern has remained the same, and that has to do with a lot of issues. A lot of what neighborhoods are like, what housing stock is like, affordability. But this basic representation of San Francisco politics hasn't changed. And to me, that's really remarkable. Now, the challenge of being a progressive mayor, of making progressive promises, is that it's very hard to be a chief executive. And I spoke to Art Agnos, and I quoted him in the book saying the difference, because he was another progressive legislator who became mayor. This is just a family shot to get us away from the map. There's no real story there, but it's a nice photo. And Moscone really had to wrestle with that. He did a couple of things as mayor that were hugely important. One was he made good on his word. He asked all the commissioners and board members to resign within his first couple weeks of office. Now, on the one hand, you can say he genuinely replaced them with a diversity that the city has never walked away from, because Feinstein kept those people in place. But he asked every board member, this is a power play, right? You can say you don't have a political machine, but when you ask every board member to resign, suddenly you have a lot of things to give away. So it's a smart politician we're talking about here, but also playing political hardball. One of the people he appointed to a board was the Board of Permit Appeals, which at that time was very important. And one of his promises was he would appoint a gay person, which gay people weren't appointed at that time. And he appointed Harvey Milk to the Board of Permit Appeals, which was kind of helped revive Milk's career. At that time had lost two elections. He was about to lose his third. And he quickly left the Board of Permit Appeals to run for the open assembly seat because of how people had, which he lost, and then he came back, and we know he got back on the board. I'm not going to go into too much here on that. But I want to talk about another challenge of being mayor of any city, is that the balance between being proactive and being reactive. This is true whenever you're a chief executive, if you're taking your job seriously and you're grounded in reality. It's not a given anymore. So on the day of George Moscone's inaugurated, you know what the Toronto newspapers are reporting? Now let's just pause for a second. What does it matter what the Toronto newspapers are reporting on the day we inaugurate a new mayor in San Francisco? The answer is this. They were reporting, we have Major League Baseball. The Giants are moving to Toronto. Not the Giants might move. It is done. Labatt Brewery has bought it, and they are moving. This was not George Moscone's fault. But you can't lose the team your first year in office and then hope to run for re-election. So he spent his first 2 months trying to keep the Giants in town. I wrote about that extensively in The Giants and Their City. I've written about that here in this book. But it took over the first 3 months, and he succeeded. It is not an overstatement to say that if he had that George Moscone kept the Giants in San Francisco. They had not been here for 20 years. Their attendance was in the toilet. The team, I remember that team. It wasn't a great one. I was just becoming a baseball fan, and despite how bad they were, I remained one for life. And he kept them in town. And that may have been his biggest accomplishment, because the rest of the time, the task of governing was so difficult. And I think there's a lesson there. Towards the end of his time here, he had to moonlight as a bus driver. No, sorry. Towards the end of his time in office, June of that year, Prop 13 passes. And that's a body blow to city governance. And so he spends his last months reacting to that. And the last speeches, some given, some not given, the interviews he's giving towards the end of 78, gearing up for running for re-election, he's talking about his accomplishments, balancing the budget, and getting more police on the street. That could come out of Giuliani's mouth. Certainly could have come out of Joe Liotta or Dianne Feinstein's, the mayor both before and after him. And I raise this to point out how difficult the task of being mayor is. And that a talented politician, skilled legislature, converting that to being a groundbreaking mayor is genuinely difficult. And you know, when I set out to write this book, and as I was interviewing people and talking to people who knew Moscone, one of the things that I really promised myself I would do, is to not make this about the last 2 weeks of his life. We know how this is I think it's a cinematic story. It's a great story. We know the ending in advance, and it's not a happy one. We can't change that. And what that means is that, for me, is that what kind of mayor he would have been, it's in the category of what might have been. We'll never know. And we can ask ourselves, would he have won for re-election? I don't know. Who would have come after him? Would Harvey Milk have been mayor after 8 years of George Moscone? I don't know. Would San Francisco look different? Yes. Can we know how it would look different? No, we can't. This, I find this very moving. For me, this is a press release for a statement Moscone was going to make at noon on November 27th, 1978, appointing Don Horanzi to the board to replace Dan White. And in handwriting, and I've asked, I don't know whose handwriting it is, it says never issued. Now, had Horanzi been appointed to the board, there would have been a progressive majority on the board. Likely they would have voted Feinstein out, Gordon Lau in, and he finally would have had that progressive majority for the last year of his mayoralty. It would have been very different, and we just don't know. We just don't know the answer to that. We just don't know what that would have looked like. I want to thank you for your attention. It is really, when you spend a lot of time, and often I spent most of the pandemic doing research on this, and to be able to talk to real living people about this is really a pleasure, and it's a pleasure to be invited. I'll be signing books in the back. Like I said, there's a 25% discount. It's an expensive book, but it's worth it. If you want more of me, or if you if you need to reach me for anything, that's my email, that's my website. If you want to, I have a Substack, Kibitzing with Lincoln. I learned that word in Catholic school. And I write about kind of national politics, San Francisco politics, and baseball. So thank you again, and I'm happy to take any questions. Yes.
Question and answer. Let me give you the basic format. You raise your hand. I will try to make eye contact with you and let you know I know you're there, so you don't have to stand there or sit there with your hand up until we get to you. Chris is working the other side of this. If you're up front, I'll take your question from here. And when it's further back, then Chris will circulate as well. So I think there's going to be some questions. All right, let me start here. You'll be second. You'll be third. Okay. Start.
Did his children ever consider a career in politics?
Not that I know of. I spoke to his two sons. Now, Chris, his oldest son, his older of two sons, his daughters were born first, and his sons, became a lawyer and was around City Hall, but not thinking about running for office. And John worked in the theater, and the two daughters, I never really asked them that question.
Thank you.
Question back here, then we'll move up further.
How tall was he?
Who? Me? He's about 6'1". Yeah, now basketball was different back then. And people were different back then. So a 6'1", born in 1929, was quite tall.
Right.
And it was tall enough to play basketball.
Question up front. You take your
Thank you for your talk tonight. Do you think there is any substantial evidence that Moscone's work all of his positions in San Francisco, right up to the three-way mayor's race. Do you think any evidence that he pulled Dianne Feinstein more to the left than she otherwise would have?
Well, actually, it was a five-way mayor's race because Milton Marks and Jack Ertolo were in the race also. That's an interesting. Well, perhaps posthumously, Moscone, I suspect in that 75 race, consolidated the left faster than Feinstein would have liked. But a lot of that, because there was no ranked choice voting, I think a lot of liberals who maybe in their hearts preferred Feinstein went with Moscone because they were afraid of Barbara Gelato. The better example, I would say, is this. After Moscone was assassinated, of course, Feinstein became mayor. And she did a few important things with regards not just to Moscone's memory, but to his political memory. So, for example, she kept all these people on the various boards and commissions, and she kept that commitment that Moscone had articulated so strongly to really keeping a diverse group there. Secondly, and this is important, she honored his wish to have Horanzi appointed for Dan White's old seat, honored Harvey Milk's wish to have Harry Britt appointed because Milk had been assassinated, and of course the seat was open. In case I'm assassinated, he didn't know what was happening, that this was going to happen. Maybe he had premonition. And then she appointed her own person, which is fine. Quentin Kopp began to run against her for mayor in 79. And that's a complicated in all of that now. But the Moscone people rallied behind Feinstein and really helped her in that election because they did not like Quentin Kopp. And that may have pushed her a little bit leftward, having the full support of that. And she would not have won that race without the Moscones, the people, not him. He was, of course, gone.
We have another question in the back, and then you're next.
Yeah, there's a perception of some folks that Mayor Moscone didn't actually do as much as he could have or should have done in the so-called progressive San Francisco movement, however you want to describe that. Some people say he could have done more dealing the back then Manhattanization of San Francisco was a big issue, and the planning issues. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
My sense is that when he was in the legislature, he was not in the weeds. This is just based on my research on the kind of local policy questions here. So in that sense, he was not taking a lead role. He was on the board where he did take a lead role, an important role in those things. As mayor, it's the critique as mayor is that he got elected on this very groundbreaking progressive platform and then didn't. It's hard to describe his 3 years as groundbreakingly progressive governance. On the other hand, remember, his first 2 years, Quentin Kopp was the president of the board, and he had a conservative majority, and the second 2 years, Feinstein did. But I think that's the heart of the question, right? Particularly with regards to his time as mayor. I think as in Sacramento, he was doing Sacramento things, and that is the role of that job. But as mayor, could he have governed differently? Of course he could have, but it's hard to know exactly what that might have looked like.
All right. I was wondering, in terms of being a mayor when the Fillmore had been torn down and maybe there was more development, also like the I Hotel, just San Francisco's development changing. What was his stance on kind of like affordable housing as well as in like I look at the photo there, like the integrity of like really important architecture that had been taken down?
Well, the affordable housing issue was a little different back then because there was a lot of, it wasn't an issue, basically. The San Francisco, and according to the 1980 census, had about, let me say this, 1950 census, 750,000 people in San Francisco. We never got that population that high again until the year 2000. So his political life was in a period where there was a bigger issue, how do we keep jobs and people here, rather than how do we create affordable housing. I think he was against the redevelopment, but more from the kind of civil rights perspective, that he believed this community, the people in that neighborhood who were heavily African-American, were being mistreated by the redevelopment agency. So he was opposed to that. I did not, weighing in terms of things like the architectural, I didn't get much of that, except for that he was somebody who loved the city, and if we think of city politics today, there's always this kind of sense of, he was not somebody who arrived here, at 9 a.m. and by lunchtime was telling everyone what the city should look like. And I think we have a lot of that now.
Wait, question over here?
Do you have a sense of what was the genesis of his progressive policy?
Thanks for asking. I should say that, because I said I was going to end with two questions. And one of my questions was exactly that. Like, where does this come from? And I wrestled with that a lot because I heard people, a lot of said he played basketball. The neighbor, you go to the Mission, you hear Spanish, you go to the Fillmore, you're playing with African American people. But I played baseball in every neighborhood of the city between roughly 1977 and 1985. And I'm not exaggerating. And unlike George Moscone, who was, basketball's a different game, and also he was a star, I had a lot more time to sit on the bench and reflect. And one thing I learned is that my teammates, you'd go to a black neighborhood or something, and they saw the signs of it being a lower-income community, and that led them to racist conclusions. Not all of them, but some of them. To others, it led to progressive conclusions. So my sense is that you take out what you bring in. You're not just changed because you went and played basketball against some people of a different ethnic background. I don't buy that. I think seeing his mother struggling financially, working hard. His mother worked at the DMV, not as like the commissioner of the DMV, but as someone like, I wanted to get my license. You talk to George Moscone's mom, or she's the one behind the counter, right? That was a tough job, hard work. She worked a lot, didn't have a lot of money. I think that made an impression on him. His father at one point was a guard at St. Quentin, and there's a vague story about him taking young George Moscone there, and him really, and also growing up in a city where labor was really important, and labor backed Moscone every time he ran. So and then it's just, I don't know that there was some radicalizing experience. I don't know. There are plenty of people who come from modest backgrounds, go to elite high schools, and use that as their ticket into a more conservative, financially lucrative life. Moscone never made any money. So and I spent about the last 20 pages trying to kind of work through this, and I can kind of leave that to the reader, but I propose some ideas.
Another question back here? Take that.
Yeah, you've partially answered this already about, was Feinstein kind of right in the middle? What were the differences in her platform and issues than Moscone? And secondly, can you remind us who the Chronicle, Examiner, even the Bay Guardian were backing, and were they very influential in the election?
Where Feinstein differed was that there was this kind of bubbling political movement in San Francisco at the time, the Community Congress, pushing for district elections. Feinstein was never for that. So essentially, on the social issues, like Feinstein was very good on civil rights and very good on LGBT issues. And for the most part, the gay media and gay activist community was divided, not with Barbara Gelada, but between Feinstein and Moscone. The African-American civil rights movement, largely with Moscone, but somewhat with Feinstein. The biggest issue there of dividing Feinstein and Moscone was Feinstein was the candidate of downtown. She was, I think that every mayor we've had since Dianne Feinstein is essentially another version of Dianne Feinstein. That's certainly true of Daniel Lurie. Even they're from the same neighborhood, but that kind of, he's good. Daniel Lurie is not a bigot, and Feinstein wasn't a bigot. But they're going to side with, they both sided with downtown on key economic questions. So that's, I think, the biggest difference. The Bay Guardian was, essentially with Moscone, but they didn't say it like that. The Examiner and the Chronicle, very reactionary. But again, they could get their economic goals without the kind of vulgarity of Barbara Gelada. But where you really saw the reactionary politics was their just rants about district elections. They were, like no one ever heard of electing people by districts. Of course, how we do it in the whole country, in every state, and almost every city in America, right? But you really saw that. But Moscone, he didn't, in politics, if you want to be successful, there's two gifts you can have. One of them, particularly in Democratic Party politics, is to be a liberal in a conservative body. And that was Moscone. No matter what, he was the guy, and in his first campaigns, they're always talking about where he went to high school. As late as the early 70s, this was a city where that was relevant, really relevant, right? And that he lives in the Sunset and Italian and all this, and and then Feinstein's the opposite. Right? Feinstein was in the Senate for, I think, 118 years, and the entire time, most of the country assumed she was more liberal than she was because she was a Jewish woman from San Francisco, right? So she's kind of a moderate or even a conservative Democrat in a liberal body. So that I think that was kind of the crux of the difference between them.
I was wondering, could you comment on the photos for your book cover?
Yes. So the one at the top, that's just George Moscone hanging out at home in a very 70s outfit, and that's from the Moscone family. The one on the left is, I believe, Moscone congratulating the winners of the cable car bell ringing contest. And that's from the San Francisco. And then the bottom is Dave Glass, who is actually here tonight, who is a fantastic San Francisco photographer who has been taking photos of the city for, I think, forever. That is one of his photos, and there's several more of his in the book.
Let me make my little comment. I'm 12 years younger than George Moscone. And I went to SI. And I found that there was a lot of contention among the Jesuits who really didn't feel very supportive of him because he came from here, but he's not one of us. That he kind of turned his back because they were much more conservative and he was not.
That's absolutely right.
Yep.
That's absolutely right. And I think that was not just the Jesuits, that was the community in general.
Yeah.
You know, there's that famous story where Khrushchev, I know this is a little bit far from San Francisco politics, forgive me for a second, but Khrushchev meets Zhou Enlai. This is in the early 70s, and as you, I don't know, pay attention to this, we used to be concerned about communism. And now we just have a government that tells us where we can go and what we can read, so we don't have to worry about that anymore. But Khrushchev came from very, real working class. He was a coal miner in Ukraine. You know, it was a tough way to make a living. And Zhou Enlai came from a refined Chinese family, and when they met, Khrushchev says to Zhou Enlai, isn't it, notable that I'm from this peasant worker background and you're from this upper class background? And Zhou Enlai responds, yes, and we both betrayed our class. And I think there was a sense among a lot of Moscone's ethnic cohorts that he had betrayed them. So there was, and there was, I don't, like I said, I don't spend a lot of time on the assassinations, but you will see coverage of the assassinations and of Dan White, who of course died in '85. And they'll say things like the most hated man ever in San Francisco. Dan White was celebrated by a good 40% of the city at that time. And those of you who are here know that. And I was a kid, but I was in Catholic school. I've spoken to friends who were in independent private schools as well as public schools, junior high school, and at least half the kids cheered when they heard the news. And at that age, we're talking 6th grade, they're getting it from their parents. So he was seen as gone over to the other side and running around with these gay people and these African American people. Now, I'm not, and some people were upset about that, and some people, were happy that he did that. But there was that. It was not that simple. And that's why, the SI story is complicated and has to be understood as such.
We have another question here.
Can you talk a little bit about the changes in the police department and the sheriff's department during the time when Moscone was mayor? Was that Peter Nardozo in the photograph with him on Mission Street?
The aide in the suit? No, that was Corey Bush. Yeah. Corey Bush, not the congresswoman from St. Louis, but Corey Bush. But the issue, this is really important. The Officers for Justice, which was a group of African-American police officers, had been fighting to integrate the police force for years. And finally, the Carter administration Justice Department made a decree, and the legalese this gets a little confusing, saying they had to do it. And this was a big win, but it needed approval by the Board of Supervisors. And the Board of Supervisors vote was divided. And the 6th vote against it, which would have killed it, belonged to Dan White. And when he left the board, Moscone had the votes to pass the consent decree, which would have quickly and somewhat radically integrated the police force, which is what he had wanted, and many of his constituents wanted. The police wanted Dan White back on the board. And that is why police, if you read David Talbot's book, this is what Talbot really gets right? That's why they play Danny Boy after they learn of the news, right? Talbot calls it a police hit. He's not obviously wrong. And that was that Dan White, who was unhinged and didn't, I was talking to the media about this, and I said, you know, the story of Dan White is so much focuses on his bigotry, and his his precarious mental state, and those things are true, but they overlooked that he also really wasn't very smart, because what he could have done, because he left the board legitimately because he didn't have enough money. All he needed to do was to go to the cops, go to the real estate interests, and say, "You need my vote. You got to hire me as a consultant for $10,000 a year," which was a lot of money back then, but not that much money back then. And he would have been fine. He didn't have the brains to do that. Then he wanted to get back on the board, and then one thing led to another. But I think that the issue of integrating the police force is absolutely central to why Moscone was killed.
Someone online?
Yes, a question from online. From Bernal Heights, what had Moscone to say about Prop 13, and did he faintly grasp that location, values, and our community property?
So Moscone opposed Proposition 13 when it was on the ballot, as did pretty much all the supervisors. Proposition 13 devastated San Francisco, and Moscone was aware of that, and he spent the last really 6 months of his life trying to figure out what to do, because the budget cuts were very fast. So he was so it really I think he was aware of what was coming down the pike. There wasn't much he could do about it. The money just wasn't there anymore. But it was not. I mean, this was, Prop 6 was defeating Prop 6 was a big win that fall, but Prop 13 that summer just devastated the city and made it a very different ballgame for Moscone.
All right. Thank you very much, Lincoln.
Thank you.